So last week we read about Ashupati standing on the transition line, and this canto, book 1, canto 3, is about his transition from a life of ignorance to a life of knowledge. Not ignorance and knowledge as we understand it, but ignorance and knowledge in terms of yoga. In yogic terms, ignorance is by the very fact the consciousness enters into a state of narrowness, into a state of self-forgetfulness, that is ignorance. And as consciousness awakens to vaster and vaster realms of its own self-existence, till it recovers and repossesses its entire unity and oneness, that is freedom, and that is freedom from ignorance. So this is the transition Aurobindo is speaking of, and he has already given us a hint that in human beings this transition starts with the awakening of the psychic impulse, traveling from life to life, from body to body, and a point comes when the psychic being begins to identify more and more not with the transient symbols but what they represent, and it begins to identify more and more with the substance of its undying self. That's what we read last time. And the goal of this journey, the entire journey, Aurobindo maps out in as if in a few giant steps. We were on page 24 where he speaks of this culminating point of the journey. Then is revealed in man the overt divine. So the journey of human life starts from ignorance and it ends with a complete identification, growing into the likeness of the divine consciousness. A static oneness and dynamic power descend in him, the integral Godhead seal. His soul and body take that splendid stamp. So this is the journey. Now the beauty of this canto is that Aurobindo, there are a number of very interesting things about this canto. One is that Aurobindo makes a grand summary, and then he keeps enlarging, almost like if a painter paints first the large outlines, then he fills few details, then he fills more and more details and more and more details. So this is something like this, almost like a zoom in effect. So this is one part which is very interesting about this whole canto. The second is that this transition from ignorance or a state of ignorance and division to a state of knowledge and oneness has been attempted in the past yogas. In fact, this is what yoga has meant earlier. And this transition takes place through several lines. For instance, there is a whole line of experience where one grows by catching the thread of the subtle sounds, and goes from gross to the subtle to the subtler to the subtlest states of consciousness. Now the beauty of this canto is that Aurobindo takes up all these experiences and synthesizes them together like many streams rushing towards one mighty Ganges. So this is the beauty of this canto, and as we proceed we shall see. We had paused on page 24, the fourth line from below. In him that high transition laid its base. So this is the transition from the animal man to the man divine. And Aurobindo will first tell us the major giant steps, the major lines: original and supernal immanence, of which all nature's process is the art. The cosmic worker set his secret hand to turn this frail mud engine to heaven use. So this mud engine, which is normally at the mercy and for the uses of ego and desire, and is driven by the mind, this frail mud engine has been now turned in Ashupati to heaven use. It has become an instrument of a higher, of a greater consciousness, the immanent divine. A presence wrought behind the ambiguous screen. It beat his soil to bear a titan's weight, refining half-hewn blocks of natural strength. It built his soul into a statued God. So our nature right now is not able to bear even a little bit of the touch of the higher. Even a little bit of extra vital energy tends to upset us. And in Ashupati now, his consciousness, his nature is being refined and prepared to bear a titan's weight. This is a very interesting aspect of the Vedic yoga, where it is said that the human instrument is a vessel, and if the vessel is half baked, it will break down under the pressure of the higher consciousness and the higher truth. So here we read this line, which almost reminds one of this idea in the Vedas. It beat his soil to bear a titan's weight. The craftsman of the magic stuff of self, who labors at his high and difficult plan in the wide workshop of the wonderful world, modeled in inward time his rhythmic parts. Then came the abrupt transcendent miracle. So this is the process that a divine labor begins to labor in the consciousness till it becomes ready to receive the divine influx. So a few lines below, a mystery of married earth and heaven annexed divinity to the mortal scheme. So this first conquest, this first inner conquest, is the freedom of our inner being from the grip of ignorance. So this is the first transformation that is necessary. And as this happens, as our consciousness, our sight, our senses, our thought, our emotions, our will gets free from the trappings of the sense-bound mind, gets free from the heavy inertia and inertia-driven base of matter, what happens to us is a seer was born, a shining guest of time. For him, mind's limiting firmament ceased above. In the griffin forefront of the night and day, a gap was rent in the all-concealing vault. The conscious ends of being went rolling back. The landmarks of the little person fell. The island ego joined its continent. So normally we live in a very, very narrow, circumscribed bounds which have been determined for us by nature. And for each species, nature has set a little circle, and it moves within that circle, it grows within that circle, and it dies within that circle. Now, true, this circle has been enlarged for man, and man is not just one type, but many, many types within one single large circle of ignorance. And yet, there is a curve from which he returns. But in Ashupati, in a yogi who seeks to free himself from ignorance, this gap, this roof, this hard crust between the mind and the beyond is broken. There is a gap. This is the first thing that happens, and through this gap, the small egoistic being or the consciousness bound to the limited egoistic consciousness, it begins to escape above, and it begins to experience a vaster, a freer, a mightier, a larger, a more luminous seeing, a vaster love, and the whole experience of life undergoes a change, as the mother says, a reversal of values, a reversal of consciousness. Just a couple of lines below, overpast was this world of rigid limiting forms, life's barriers opened into the unknown, abolished were conceptions, covenants, and striking off subjections, rigorous clause, annul the soul's treaty with nature's nescience. So we have chosen, this is very interesting, that soul has for its own reason chosen to play at being bound and being subject to ignorance. And by its own will it can free itself. This is something very beautiful. Aurobindo says that the highest knowledge tells us, reveals to us that none is free, none is bound. We only play at being that. So here the soul strikes off its treaty with nature's nescience and chooses by its own will to go beyond the limited and the limiting firmaments. So here Aurobindo describes this process very beautifully. All the grey inhibitions were torn off. All that the minds can be and cannot be, all that the thought tells us, those conceptions, those ideas, those self-contradictions, they cease to be in a vast unity, and broken the intellect's hard and lustrous lid. Now this is very interesting, because as Aurobindo is describing us, this is not just metaphor and symbol. Actually, it's an actual process of yoga. There is a point of time when one can actually experience and see literally this hard crust suddenly thinning and breaking off. And the results that follow or what happens with Ashupati and and his consciousness being freed from ignorance. There is a very interesting story, anecdote I remember about Vasishtha Ganpati Muni, who was a disciple of Sri Raman Maharishi, and he had come to Sri Aurobindo and the mother, and he had seen in them the divine forms. In fact, he remarked divine Murtulu, Divya Murtulu, the divine forms I am seeing in them. And he experienced his experience when he actually experienced going beyond the circle of ignorance. He would actually experience a great fire come out of his head, and this fire was so intense that he could not quench it, and it started revealing many things to him. So this is not just a metaphor, it's a real experience that the intellect's hard and lustrous lid is broken, and that is why if the mind is not ready, if the rest of the consciousness is not ready, it can actually upset, because we live in certain fixed frames of reference points. Truth unpartitioned found immense sky room, an empyrean visions saw and knew, the bounded mind became a boundless light, the finite self mated with infinity. So here in the synthesis, Sri Aurobindo describes very beautifully that we are done with the galley slave labor of the mind, which labors to know, reads from here, reads from there, gathers plenty of information, and yet at the end is able to know very little. But this mind, the moment the limiting barriers of ignorance crash, even the first early glimpses, this mind which is bounded begins to become a boundless mind. It's no more bounded by our sense view, and it can access all knowledge if it wants to. His march now soared into an eagle's flight. Here again we see a very interesting symbol of the eagle. Apart from the appearance of eagle in inner terms, the eagle has a very interesting vision that eagle can see three things at the same time, and it knows exactly with a great precision what exactly is required, to what extent it should dive, and what should be its speed to pick up and reach another point. So eagle's vision is often compared with the vision of a higher consciousness, unlike other kinds of vision. So eagle has a very holistic vision with regard to the thing that is in front of it. So here we have his march now soared into an eagle's flight. Out of apprenticeship to ignorance, wisdom upraised him to her master craft and made him an arch mason of the soul, a builder of the immortal secret house, an aspirant to supernal timelessness. Freedom and empire called to him from on high, above mind's twilight and life's star-led night, there gleamed the dawn of a spiritual day. So this is the very first, Sri Aurobindo describes the very first step, which is the rending of the gap. It can be rent from any point. It can be rent in the mind, it can be rent in the heart, it can be rent in the will. But in Ashupati we see this gap is first taking place in the mind, and therefore he is growing in a certain way. His journey is taking a certain course. But what is the course for man to follow, that will come, because here he gives us the large lines of this journey, but the path for man to follow comes in the book of Yoga, when the mother shows the way through the psychic being. But here we see the gap starting between the mind and the beyond, and this has been the traditional path of yoga. Most traditional paths start from the mind and go into the beyond. So what are the large steps of the journey? What are the first experiences that come? We have this new movement, as so he grew into his larger self. Humanity framed his movements less and less. A greater being saw a greater world. So first it's a new seeing. The mother has described this as a reversal of consciousness. So we begin to see things differently. We begin to experience things very differently. A fearless will for knowledge dared to erase the lines of safety reason draws that bar mind soar, souls dive into the infinite. So reason always sets certain norms. It always says that you should live within these boundaries, and this is the sure and safer road for man, rather than suddenly attempting the great adventure of the unknown. But one touch of the higher consciousness draws away that bar, and our soul is free to soar and dive into the infinite. Even his first steps broke our small earth bounds and loitered in a vaster, freer air. In hand sustained by a transfiguring might, he caught up lightly like a giant's bow, left slumbering in a sealed and secret cave the powers that sleep unused in man within. He made of miracle a normal act, and turned to a common part of divine works, magnificently natural at this height, efforts that would shatter the strength of mortal hearts, pursued in a royalty of mighty ease, aims too sublime for nature's daily will. The gifts of the Spirit crowding came to him. They were his life's pattern and his privilege. This is a very interesting story. When Dilip Kumar Roy went to a tantric yogi in East Bengal, and he wanted to take initiation. He had already actually met Sri Aurobindo, and this yogi asked him to sit down for some time, and suddenly he said, "But your guru is already with you." So Dilip Kumar Roy asked him, "But who?" He said, "Of course, Sri Aurobindo." And then he said that, "I see him behind you, and he is sitting on a mountain of all the yogic realizations and siddhis, and what kind of a fool are you that you have come to me for initiation?" And the interesting part of this conversation is that Sri Aurobindo had not even told Dilip Kumar Roy that, "Yes, I have initiated or accepted you in the path." So this becomes so natural to a yogi. These gifts of the Spirit, the powers, the knowledge, they become his way of life. It enveloped all nature in a single glance. It looked into the very self of things. We all have read Sri Aurobindo's poem Cat, and one fancies that Sri Aurobindo wrote it while looking at Kiki the cat. And we know this was the cat, and there was also a dog called Goldie. And how would Sri Aurobindo be seeing this cat? So Sri Aurobindo has a very beautiful poem on this cat. The poem is named Despair on the Staircase, and maybe one can read it later on from the collected poems. And Sri Aurobindo ends it with two very interesting lines. Whether she is a woman, whether she is a spirit, a woman, or a cat, this is the mystery I am wondering at. So, looking at beings, the one who has grown out from ignorance is able to see the very self of things, and he is no more deceived by anything, deceived no more by form. He saw the soul. In fact, in evening talks, Nirodha asked Sri Aurobindo once that how do you see, when you look at what is meant by seeing Brahman everywhere? Then he describes it in very interesting terms. He says, when I look at Dr. Manilal, I see, Manilal used to be one of the attendants incidentally. He says, I don't just see Manilal, I see Brahman becoming Manilal. And I see the Brahman everywhere. And even with Dara, when he came to Sri Aurobindo and he asked, is the divine everywhere? And Sri Aurobindo is reported to have put his foot a little with a little thud on the stool and said, yes, he is everywhere. And Dara instantly experienced the divine everywhere. So this is the kind of consciousness in which one awakens when one is freed from ignorance, which is so different from the way we commonly understand ignorance and knowledge. It seized the idea in mind, the wish in the heart. In fact, just yesterday someone was narrating to me something very interesting. It used to be, some of the people when they would get them married or when their children got married, they sent the photograph to the mother, and the mother would say sometimes she would approve, sometimes she would remain non-committal, just say blessings, etc., etc. So this man was telling me that when my father sent my photograph and my would-be wife's photograph to the mother, then mother gazed at it for a very long time, and at the end of it she said that let him go and see the girl and decide. Now this was very unusual, and he says the strange part is that though I was in Andhra that time, I was actually, when I came to know that my father is sending the photograph, I was not very happy about it, and I was wondering if it would be much better if I could see and make a choice for myself. And the mother literally told his father that you tell him to see the girl and choose for himself. So it's very interesting. We see this here in beings. It knew what lurked to them unknown. It seized the idea in mind, the wish in the heart. It plucked out from grey folds of secrecy the motives which from their own sight men hide. He felt the beating life in other men, invade him with their happiness and their grief, their love, their anger, their unspoken hopes, entered in currents or in pouring waves into the immobile ocean of his calm. The other days we were speaking of cosmic consciousness. This is the first experience of the cosmic consciousness, where we begin to experience what is happening in others as naturally as we experience it in ourselves. In fact, in the Gita there is a very interesting description of Sthit Prajna, the man who is settled in the consciousness of truth, in the consciousness of oneness. The description is Apuryamadam Achalam Pratishtam. He in whom desires enter like rivers into a sea, and yet he remains unmoved and calm and immobile. And we see here a very, very similar description. He felt the beating life in other men, invade him with their happiness and their grief, their love, their anger, their unspoken hopes, entered in currents or in pouring waves into the immobile ocean of his calm. He heard the inspired sound of his own thoughts, re-echoed in the vault of other minds. So not only his way of receiving things changes, even his way of action begins to change. Aurobindo writes with regard to his moving to Pondicherry that this was not a retirement from world. In fact, it was a greater world action, because he did not need, in fact he writes it in third person, that Aurobindo's retirement from the world was not a escape from the world, but a greater action, because he could act upon the world through ways and means which were no longer necessary, which were which earlier was not there accessible, but they were accessible to him, these means of action subsequently. So he could be in one room and act upon the world. And then he says that only twice he tried to act in the normal way, and he speaks of, one was during the Second World War and second time during the Cripps proposal. And he says both the times when he actually entered into the outward field, he found mixed results, and therefore he once again went back and resorted to inner means. So these are the inner means through which this is the inner life of the yogi, if we may say so, that he receives things through a knowledge which is direct, and he acts upon the world in a manner which is much more direct and much more powerful. And we know this entire episode of Aurobindo with Winston Churchill, that not only Aurobindo would literally put the speech into his head, but sometimes listening to his speech he would say, he was receptive at this point, and this where he missed out this particular thing which he could have spoken. So we have here this power that develops into a yogin to reach out to others in his own way. He heard the inspired sound of his own thoughts re-echoed in the vault of other minds. The world's thought streams travelled into his ken. His inner self grew near to other selves. And this we will see that in Aurobindo's writings, often he speaks of the thought currents, not only of his time, but many times it seems that Aurobindo caught the thought currents of the coming age, of the coming generation. And he not only anticipated it, he answered it. So this is because even thoughts and ideas flow in large spaces of time in the mind spaces, and those who are awakened in these higher domains can catch these streams much before they have actually arrived. And these are the men who are so-called far ahead of their time. The world's thought streams travelled into his ken. His inner self grew near to other selves and bore a kinship's weight, a common tie. And that's where is the beauty. Yet stood untouched, king of itself, alone. So these are the experiences of the cosmic consciousness. And then we have a few lines below this: the soul's experience of its deeper sheaths, no more slept drugged by matter's dominance. So we have in us, as the yogic knowledge tells us, not only a physical body but a vital body, a mental body, a spiritual body, or a causal body, and a bliss body. And normally we don't experience or we don't live in those bodies, because entering into the hard and dull and inert sheath of matter, all these sheaths are not able to function fully. And by the power of yoga and the grace of the divine Shakti, as these deeper layers begin to emerge, we begin to experience what is natural and native to these higher selves, if one may say so. The soul's experience of its deeper sheaths, no more slept drugged by matter's dominance. And again, a few 3 lines below: a door parted, built in by matter's force, releasing things unseized by earthly sense, a world unseen, unknown by outward mind, appeared in the silent spaces of the soul. He sat in secret chambers, looking out into the luminous countries of the unborn. So the mother speaks of this emergence from matter's hedge and fence into another dimension, which she has termed as the 4th dimension. So into the 4th dimension when we enter, then we look at things very differently, and many things begin to appear which are normally not visible and accessible. So some of these things Aurobindo describes. He saw the perfect in their starry homes. These perfect are of course the greatest gods, wearing the glory of a deathless form, lain in the arms of the eternal's peace, wrapped in the heartbeats of God ecstasy. He lived in the mystic space where thought is born and will is nursed by an ethereal power, and fed on the white milk of the eternal strength till it grows into the likeness of a god. So here it's an allusion to the Vedic myth of Aditi, or the undivided consciousness nurturing the gods. So these gods by their very nature are those who live in the consciousness of oneness, and they grow into strength and wisdom by drinking the milk of the mother of the gods, who is none else but the divine power, the Adi Shakti. So here we have this in very symbolic form: and fed on the white milk of the eternal strength till it grows into the likeness of a god. Just a few lines below we have again, these are very profound and occult experiences. He gazed across the empty stillnesses and heard the footsteps of the undreamed idea in the far avenues of the beyond. So even things that have not yet manifested, that have not yet been born into the thought world, because in the process of manifestation, things first appear in the world of ideas. Here idea is of course not the human idea, but the world of typal ideas, the overmental worlds. And from there they come down and enter into the thought world. Then they press upon the human mind's imagination and the vital will, and then they finally appear in terms of the world and in matter. But the yogin sees far, far beyond and far ahead, because he sees that which is yet not manifested, not only upon earth but also in the world of ideas and the mind. He heard the secret voice, the word that knows, and saw the secret face that is our own. The inner planes uncovered their crystal doors. Strange powers and influences touched his life. A vision came of higher realms than ours, a consciousness of brighter fields and skies, of beings less circumscribed than brief-lived men. So these beings of the vital and the mental worlds are much less circumscribed. They are more fluid, they are vaster, they can change their forms readily and easily. They can manifest their consciousness in other bodies, many bodies, more bodies than one. So these are some of the properties which are native to beings of the higher worlds, which we as human beings do not have. and subtler bodies than these passing frames, objects too fine for our material grasp, acts vibrant with a superhuman light, and movements pushed by a superconscient force, and joys that never flowed through mortal limbs, and lovelier scenes than earth's, and happier lives, a consciousness of beauty and of bliss, a knowledge which became what it perceived, replaced the separated sense and heart, and drew all nature into its embrace. This is very interesting because it shows us in a very brief way what is the difference between knowledge in ignorance and knowledge of the higher sphere. In Life Divine, Aurobindo speaks of it as knowledge by identity. So this knowledge becomes what it perceives. In us, we know things as if from outside. We are not that, and we study and understand other things, other objects, other people, other phenomena. But here, the knowledge in the higher spheres becomes what it perceives. So it becomes a knowledge of the self. So the knowledge of the self in the higher sphere, even when it includes each separate things, it is seen as one's own self. In the Ish Upanishad, we have this beautiful couplets speaking of this knowledge, the oneness. Yastu sarvani bhutani atmaya vabhud vijanata tatra ko moha ka shoka ekatvam anupashyata. So it is that sense of oneness where each separate becomings, each separate objects are seen as nothing else but one being. So here we read, these are the very first experiences of Ashupati. And drew all nature into its embrace. The mind leaned out to meet the hidden worlds. And now we see that just as we have a earthly mind and the earthly senses, there are subtler and subtler layers of the mind with greater and richer reaches, and corresponding to this mind there are subtle senses. So the human senses are actually a degradation from a supreme sense. Aurobindo speaks of even a supramental sense, a supramental touch, a supramental thought. So here we have of course, this is not a description of the supermind, but these subtle senses and how these senses can perceive reality in a very different way. Air glowed and teemed with marvelous shapes and hues. So it's a common experience to yogins that when they become freed in their inner beings, or during the process of this freedom, they begin to actually strange and fragrant perfume smells, they begin to get around them. And sometimes it's a whole science. Just by the smell they can sense what kind of being is present in their atmosphere. And actually it's not very difficult to get just a kind of glimpse of it. Like for instance, when we are ill, then we will notice a certain kind of smell that emanates from our body. Similarly, when we say visit to a place like say Aurobindo's room, and we have another kind of smell. It is said that from Aurobindo's body always a very subtle lotus fragrance used to come, and that's why perhaps this whole tradition came out for lighting an agarbatti and perfume and incense, because these smells are they attract even the gods, because these are the smells and these are the sounds that the gods hear, and the gods and the higher consciousness loves. So when we have these sound symbols and when we have these fragrances in the atmosphere, there is a tendency for these greater beings to come closer to the earth, and vice versa also. For instance, the smell of cigarette smoke, it repels the higher beings, and often it brings in adverse beings in the atmosphere. Incidentally, when Aurobindo was asked which is the worst kind of smell, Aurobindo remarked that the smell of sex is the worst kind of smell. So it's very interesting that there is a whole way of knowing things through the growth of the inner senses, and much which human beings love may not be very pleasant to higher beings, and vice versa. In the nostrils quivered celestial fragrances. On the tongue lingered the honey of paradise. So even the not only smell and vision, but also the sense of taste undergoes a change, and one tastes what is called as the honey of paradise. In ancient yoga, this is a tradition of what they call as to taste the Amrit. Now, tasting Amrit is supposed to be one of the interesting aspects of yoga, which indicate that this person is a candidate for immortality. It's another matter that it has been reduced just to ignorant tradition, but behind it, this is the truth, that a yogin, as his senses begin to become free, can actually experience deeper and subtle things. On the tongue lingered the honey of paradise, a channel of universal harmony. Hearing was a stream of magic audience, a bed for occult sounds earth cannot hear. When Nirodha once asked Aurobindo about a whole branch of yoga called Nadi Yoga and Shabad Yoga, that people through the sound they reach its final source in the divine, then Aurobindo said this is in fact Nirodha mentioned that I have heard about this new yoga. He says there's nothing new about it. This is as ancient as the hills, and it's very well known to ancient yogins. And in another context, when somebody asked him that I hear the sound of bells, etc., he says it's a very common experience in the very early stages of sadhana. I myself had it thousands of times in the very early stages, when sounds of bells, even onkar and various kinds of sounds which are normally not heard on earth, they begin to appear inside. And from these we again see many of the symbolic activities which later on lost their real meaning came to be. A bed for occult sounds earth cannot hear. Out of a covert tract of slumber self, the voice came of a truth submerged, unknown, that flows beneath the cosmic surfaces. Only mid an omniscient silence heard, held by intuitive heart and secret sense. We can go a few lines below and maybe read a few more passages before we close. Just 3 lines from the end of the page 29. The murmur and whisper of the unheard sounds. It's a continuation of the inner hearing, which crowd around our hearts, but find no window to enter, swelled into a canticle of all that suffers to be still unknown. What a marvelous passage this is. And this particular canto is really very beautiful, extraordinarily beautiful, because it describes the journey through the higher consciousness. It's like Aurobindo taking us through various beautiful landscapes which we normally don't find on earth, or perhaps we try to clumsily recreate. So here we have the experience of unheard sounds, what are called in Indian yoga as traditional yoga as anahat nad. That sound which is unstruck without striking it. Normally to create a sound one has to create a stir or a strike, but this sound is there as a primal cosmic energy and its primal vibration. So it tries to enter us, but it suffers, it remains suppressed. In one of the places, Aurobindo remarks that man suffers not only because of the suppression of the subconscious, but also because of the suppression of the superconscious in him. So here we have this: to enter, swelled into a canticle of all that suffers to be still unknown, and all that labors vainly to be born, because we are so lost in the outer noise of the world that we are unable to tune ourselves to this inner voice. And all the sweetness none will ever taste, and all the beauty that will never be. This is the sense of will never be is about the sense of the infinity. So infinity can never completely manifest itself. There is always something which is left, which remains unmanifest. So already his consciousness is beginning to enter into the sense of infinity. And much later we see in Adoration of the Divine Mother read something very similar. The might of all that never yet came down. So here we have these lines: and all the sweetness none will ever taste, and all the beauty that will never be, inaudible to our deaf mortal ears. This is a perfect description of our human ignorance, that our eyes veil much more than we see, and in fact that's how they confuse us. And our ears are deaf to the very things that we long to hear deep inside. They are deaf to the cry of the soul, and they are deaf to the voice of the gods. The wide world rhythms wove their stupendous chant, to which life strives to fit our rhyme beats here, melting our limits in the illimitable, tuning the finite to infinity. And then we will end with this last passage, a few lines below. All was revealed there, none can here express. So these experiences are so overwhelming that our human tongue, our speech, is unable to find words to express it. And that is what great yogis have said who have experienced these truths. But this is the beauty of Sri Aurobindo, that he still expresses even when he says that none can here express. And I suppose this is the great beauty of Savitri, that he pours down these really inexpressible experiences, of which even the Upanishads say that they cannot be expressed, and great seers have said they cannot be expressed, and Sri Aurobindo is saying they cannot be expressed, and yet he expresses it. And that is the marvel of Savitri. All was revealed there, none can here express. Vision and dream were fables spoken by truth, or symbols more veridical than fact. So there a whole story, a whole truth is revealed in the form of a vision. And as one enters into the gleamings of the illumined mind and the mind, revelatory mind, truth is not revealed in terms of thoughts and words, but in terms of a vision which is more veridical than fact, or where truths enforced by supernatural seals, immortal eyes approached and looked in his, and beings of many kingdoms neared and spoke. The ever-living, whom we name as dead, could leave their glory beyond death and birth, to utter the wisdom which exceeds all phrase. Now this, of course, we know that how Sri Aurobindo heard the voice of Vivekananda for 15 days constantly while he was in Alipur jail. And he says he spoke on a very specific and a particular topic, and having said all that he had to say, he went away. Now we would in our ignorance label Swami Vivekananda as born in this year, and he left his body or died in this year. We speak the same way of Sri Ramakrishna, whose voice Sri Aurobindo heard 3 times at different points in his inner life. And we speak the same way of Buddha, whose whole communication is documented in the mother's prayers and meditation, communication received by Sakyamuni. And of course, in our folly and ignorance, we speak the same way of Sri Aurobindo, that he was born on 15th August 1872 and he left his body on 5th December 1950. Now here Sri Aurobindo is revealing us something which our mortal eyes and mortal ears do not understand. The ever-living, whom we name as dead. In fact, even before they are born, they exist. There is an interesting story about the coming of Vivekananda that Sri Ramakrishna actually experienced. He is one of the Saptrishis, the 7 Angiras sages, and he was meditating in one of the higher kingdoms, and Sri Ramakrishna in the form of a child goes and pulls him down, and then he finally comes out of his trance and says, okay, I come. So these beings, even these Vedic rishis, they are not beings who lived and died. Their consciousness continues to pervade the higher worlds, and some even lean down upon earth and guide our ignorant humanity. But not only these beings who are celestial and immortal, but even other beings of all the kingdoms come crowding to Ashupati to seek admittance and entry. The kings of evil and the kings of good, appellants at the reason's judgment seat, proclaim the gospel of their opposites, and all believe themselves spokesmen of God. The gods of light and titans of the dark battled for his soul as for a costly prize. And this is where Sri Aurobindo cautions us, even in synthesis, that as we grow into a greater and higher consciousness, not only the godly beings are attracted to us, but even the titanic beings, because so long as our consciousness is in a very circumscribed bounds, then we are no good for any of these. But as our consciousness grows greater and vaster, not only the beings of the higher worlds, but even beings of the vital worlds with large appetites and gigantic energies, they begin to crowd, because they can use such a consciousness, and if allowed entry through the intrusion of the ego. And that is why he says that as we grow, we should be very, very careful and be at utmost guard to keep the ego away, because even these thoughts that I am a great instrument of God can be enough for these beings to enter and take hold of the consciousness. So this is the phase that Ashupati is passing through. The gods of light and titans of the dark battled for his soul as for a costly prize. And we can end with these 3 lines, because in New York and in the US and other places, it's a day, and so we are going to begin a day, and we begin day in our own way. But how does a being like Ashupati begin his day? So we often speak of what would have been Aurobindo day like. So here is something about his day. Each day was a spiritual romance. So one wishes that each day we could have a spiritual romance, where we could meet our beloved, the divine beloved, in new ways, unexpected ways. Each day was a spiritual romance, as if he was born into a bright new world. Adventure leaped, an unexpected friend. There is no more fear anymore, so adventure becomes also a friend, an unexpected friend. And danger brought a keen, sweet tang of joy. Each happening was a deep experience. So I think we will pause here. Uday? Yes. Yeah, it's a very, very beautiful canto. Very, very beautiful canto. Actually, it is, every line is just worth meditating and living, and, it awakens the aspiration that this is true spiritual life. Still, if there are any questions, yeah. Yes. Yes, Sartaj. Good morning. Yes, exactly. So that's precisely why many of these approaches came from the other end. So precisely because it's like trying to tune ourselves to the higher consciousness. We take the help of something which is available on earth. So if we can find something which is in tune with the higher consciousness, it can draw the higher energies and the higher frequencies and the higher forces closer to earth, and that helps to uplift us. It's like we begin to be drowned in an atmosphere of the gods, if one wants to put it that way. And that is why in all ancient cultures, we have this stress on beautiful fragrances, perfumes, and beautiful music, even beautiful sights. And certainly of all these things, music is one of the more easily available and accessible ways through which our souls can find itself uplifted. And ideally, of course, the music that we have on earth, it's a very crude replication, but even there, like Mother has said, human voice, for instance, in its highest possibility, it can really reach very high and very close to the touch of the higher worlds. And that was what Mother was not trying, she used to bring down the higher worlds through the music. We have Mother's music, we have Sunil Das music, and in traditional yoga we have many other kinds of music. We have Sufi music, and each of these music, or we have the ragas, and each of them is one of the ways to try to open or create some chink in our thick armor into the higher consciousness. It's not the whole of it, but certainly it can create an opening. So it has a role, definitely a role. And to those who are, inclined towards it. Then there is, of course, a whole line of yoga where one meditates upon the inner sound, no more on the external music. We have Surat Shabad Yoga and Nad Yoga in the Vedas. So that is another kind. And yeah. Uday, I can't hear. I can hear a faint voice, almost like the unstruck sound. Yeah. Yes, this is better. Uh, yes, Sujata, please go ahead. Yes. 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 Y- Yes. So the constant sense of surrender is one safety, and second is Sri Aurobindo has very beautifully said not to take the bhoga of the experience, because any of these experiences, if one gets stuck or begins to, let's say for instance, gets into this thought that I am a great yogi and I am having these experiences, and that is why in the ancient yogas and even in Sri Aurobindo's yoga, it has been said that except to the guru, one should not speak about these experiences to anyone. So I am glad you brought out this point, because many times when we speak about these experiences, behind it, if we look closely, there is a subtle ego lurking. It's a wish to be someone special, to be extraordinary. And even if we start entertaining these thoughts, which are quite natural at an early stage, but the sooner we get rid of it and take it that whatever experiences one is having, it's nothing else but the gift of grace. So here Sri Aurobindo takes shows that attitude, that the gifts of the spirit came crowding down to him. So as long as we understand that they are gifts of the spirit, they are gifts of grace, and we offer it back and put it only to divine use and not for any personal aggrandization. So it demands a great degree of sincerity, and only one's own inner being will know how far one is sincere. And the second is to constantly keep on aspiring upward and not to stop at anything, even not being an instrument of the divine. Well, if one is an instrument of the divine, it's the divine's glory and not the individual's. So if we keep surrendering, keep moving upward, as the Vedic rishis said, that to keep climbing higher and higher, and not to stop at any experience, however great and wonderful that may be. And Sri Aurobindo puts it as not to take the bhoga of experience. These are some of the safeties. Essentially, it's the same thing in a nutshell, that to keep away from the ego, because ego immediately limits us and ties us down to one particular experience. So this is one of the safeties, but eventually it is the sincerity and the grace that saves. Yes. Welcome. Yes. Yes, Liz. Please go ahead. Yes. So, we become aware in the sense that we don't ask for these experiences, but they are the natural consequences of an inner growth. Now, when we begin to become aware of these experiences, or rather we grow into our larger self, they become our daily food, our daily sustenance, even we identify with these planes of consciousness. So they begin to reveal to us the world in a new light, in a different light. So there is nothing to, what Sri Aurobindo is saying to us is that there is nothing to be afraid that, we are going to lose our balance and our relationship with the outer world. On the contrary, it will become much more truer and much more real, because we will begin to see truth which is hidden behind the apparent facts of life. So this is another very beautiful thing, and we found that thought or that idea or that experience echoed in this very interesting line that annexed divinity to the mortal scheme, a marriage of earth and heaven. So this marriage actually fulfills even our earthly life. So we need not worry. These experiences actually help us make life better, both inwardly. For instance, when we live in a state of celestial joy constantly, we very naturally pour joy on others. We become more happy inside, and as a result, everybody around becomes happier. So there is nothing to worry about the balance part. But the imbalance can come if the ego takes hold. So that's where one has to be very, very careful. If the ego takes hold of these experiences, and I know of people, and I'm sure many of us know, who have actually lost their balance, who have even become gurus, or started prematurely going about and speaking about these things as if they are someone very special. So this is where one has to keep the balance. So it is the inner to make sure that the ego doesn't intrude in. That is the only safety. Otherwise they enrich us and actually help lead life much better. Yeah. So Uday, shall we meet after 2 weeks? Okay, Uday. So have a beautiful day. Yeah, have a beautiful day, everyone. Okay, bye bye. Yeah, good night. Thank you.